Hello, my name's Janet Chapman. Thank you for inviting me to talk about my project Crowd2Map in this gender webinar. So Crowd2Map has two main focuses. The first one, which I'm going to talk about today, is how we're fighting female genital mutilation, or FGM, with maps. So for those of you who may not know, FGM is the cutting of female genitalia for cultural or religious reasons. And it has 4 types. And in Tanzania, it's mostly type 1 and type 2. So the prevalence in Tanzania is shown on this map. Because it's a tribal issue, it's concentrated in particular areas towards the northeast, towards the Kenyan border. And in Tanzania, generally, girls are subjected to FGM in a cutting season, which happens during the long school holidays, so generally in December. And we're expecting a major cutting season this year in 2018. So I'm a full-time volunteer for Tanzania Development Trust. That's a volunteer-run charity that has been supporting grassroots projects in rural Tanzania for 43 years. And the largest project that we've been supporting is safe houses for girls refusing FGM in Mara. And these are run by our local representative, Robi Samweli, who's an FGM survivor herself from the Kuria tribe that continues to subject girls to FGM. She runs safe houses, particularly during the cutting season, but she also trains local activists and does a lot of outreach work. And you can see her here doing some outreach work in one of the villages, explaining about the safe houses, about the fact that FGM is illegal and extremely dangerous. Every year, many girls bleed to death and die. And so she's spreading that word. So there is a lot of work going on in this area by people like Robi Samweli. And typically she would get a phone call during the night in the middle of the cutting season saying there is a girl about to be cut in Kabancha village, for example. However, before we started this project, there were no maps of the surrounding area, there's no road signs, so it would be very difficult for her to find that village and so rescue that girl. Similarly, the girls don't know where the safe houses are and where the people that they can trust are. And as many of you already know, most of rural Africa is extremely badly mapped. The picture at the top shows rural Tanzania. Picture at the bottom is Dar es Salaam. Thanks to Romani Huria, it's extremely well mapped now, but there's still a lot of work to be done in other areas, such as Mara. So girls in rural Tanzania need maps, and we're making them. So now we've got over 8,500 global volunteers. They're from all over the world. The map on the right shows the locations of some of them, from over 60 countries now, and they're mapping from satellite images, tracing roads and buildings to make a base map to help protect girls from FGM. This is a dashboard that shows the areas of Tanzania that we've mapped so far. So this is using the hot tasking manager. And so you can see that we've started particularly in the areas where girls are at risk and near the safe house. But we've also worked in areas where we've got community groups on the ground so that they have a base map to do their community mapping on. So we've got 2 groups of volunteers. We're all entirely volunteers, no staff, very little budget. The remote volunteers are from all around the world, and they're mapping from satellite images. But then we've got local volunteers on the ground, and they're adding the names of buildings, villages, etc., using a free smartphone app called maps.me. And they're also using printed field papers, and these they fill in on paper things like names of the roads, if they exist, land use, and then they email these to a remote volunteer who adds the data into OpenStreetMap and creates printable PDFs using QGIS, which they email back so that the local volunteers can print them, so that villages can have maps of their village and showing people where to go, where the safe houses are. The two groups of volunteers are extremely different. Generally, the remote mappers are highly educated. They use maps throughout their lives, and they own and can use a large range of technology, such as laptops, smartphones, etc. The community mappers generally have not had the benefit of much education. Many of them did not even complete secondary school. They've never seen maps of their local area before this project because they didn't exist, and they had never used a smartphone or laptop or been online. Since we got a microgrant from HOP, we were able to recruit a lot of new mappers, particularly women. Prior to that, we were relying on people that had their own devices, and that was very, very few women were in that situation in rural Tanzania. So from the remote volunteers, a slight majority of female. And we did a survey in June which asked people why they'd got involved in this project. The majority of people were new to OpenStreetMap. They hadn't used it before. Many of them had never heard of it before. And the main reason that they gave for joining the project was they wanted to help. Next, they were particularly interested in FGM and/or women's rights, followed by an interest in mapping, and finally an interest in Tanzania. So as I said, smartphones are generally quite a novelty in the areas where we're mapping, and they're much more likely to be owned by men where they exist. And the microgrant and the grant from Net Hope allowed us to get devices to loan to groups of women and train them to become mappers of their own communities. But the female mappers, they face a lot of additional challenges. This is a very traditional area with very traditional gender stereotypes, and men often would tell them they're wasting their time, they should be at home, cooking, etc. They were subjected to a lot of harassment, threats, and inappropriate touching from men. They had to travel on public transport or on the back of motorbikes. And generally, sometimes the drivers, etc., and other passengers were not very supportive, even to the extent of plotting to try and lure them to dangerous places. But even though they had these challenges, they carried on mapping because they were passionate about their community, and they felt that it's really important that we need to educate people about maps and its importance to the community and the nation. They felt that men in villages needed to be educated on gender equality. Obviously, FGM is an extreme example of gender inequality, and men needed to treat women right. They also felt that security needed to be increased in the villages where they work. Generally, these are remote villages. They're a long way from police stations, so really beyond the scope of the law in many cases, which is why things like FGM can still exist. Right, so they're in a difficult position, but they still want to map. They're passionate about mapping because they say that they do it to increase development in their communities. They're passionate about the fight against FGM, and they want to help other women be able to escape gender-based violence. and they want to be part of change in their community. As part of this project, we've done a lot of training with community groups and also setting up youth mapper chapters. We've noticed that often there's a big demand for training and there's more people than equipment, and in these cases the men pretty much always take over the equipment. So this is a typical scene, the man with his hands on the keyboard and the women passively watching. When we set up a youth mapper chapter, we specified in the beginning that there needed to be posts of responsibility for men and women. When we asked the men to volunteer, pretty much every man put his hand up. When we asked the women to volunteer, nobody volunteered to begin with. They needed a lot more encouragement to put themselves forward, which they did eventually. So how can the HOT community help with these additional challenges that female mappers face in places like rural Tanzania? Firstly, I think we need to recognise the additional challenges faced by people like this and put in structures to assist them. For example, aiming for 50% participation, looking at women-only groups sometimes, being cognizant of the how men can take over in training if allowed to. We also, I feel, need to make sure that we're mapping the aspects that are of importance to women. So in this case, particularly safe places, right, for survivors of FGM, gender-based violence, etc. And develop more materials on why mapping rural areas particularly benefits women, which is something that we're trying to start doing. And also recognise that sometimes women do have additional funding needs. Generally, they are they are economically disadvantaged in areas like this, and they're much less likely to have access to devices and also access money for data, connectivity, etc. And so sometimes they particularly feel that they need official letters so that if men challenge them, they can easily respond and they have the status to go with that. So better maps have helped over 3,000 girls to find safe houses and avoid being cut, and coincided with a reduced FGM death rate of 75% in this area. We've trained over 600 local mappers, of whom around 40% are female. Here is Roby at the Safe House doing some mapping, and on the right, some of the girls learning how to use ID. Mapping is a tool towards greater gender equality, and we should support the disadvantaged and courageous community of rural female Tanzanian mappers. So this is an ongoing project. Please join us if you can. If you would like more information, please contact me. We have a website, Crowd2Map, Twitter, and that's my email address. So thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, please get in touch.